Welcome to another episode of Firearms Friday from the Wyoming State Museum here in Cheyenne. My name's Evan Green. I'm the firearms historian here for the museum, and for the last 3 or 4 years I've been going through the firearms in the permanent collection and updating the inventory information, sometimes chasing stories or anecdotes about the individual firearms. And this one has been a challenge, to say the least. It is a 1984 Winchester lever-action carbine, caliber .32 Winchester centerfire, also known as .32 Special. And that's going to be important as we proceed with the discussion. This particular rifle was shipped in 1907. And so has been around for a while. So how this works, when I'm doing this research and this work with the firearms, is I will take one of the firearms out of its rack or out of its cabinet in the vault here at the museum. And one of the first things I'll do is kind of look it over, and then I will go to the accession file, which has all the information that's available about that particular firearm. It will tell us who donated it. It will, and what else came in with it, possibly. It will have condition reports. It will have research information about the gun. So when I opened the session file on this particular Winchester carbine, I went, wow, this is amazing, because there was this letter in there. And this is addressed to Mr. Robert Hainsworth, who was secretary of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association at the time. The letter was written in 1959. And it says, "Dear Bob, regarding the rifle which you picked up at my home in Thermopolis, here is the outline of its history. At the time of the Spring Creek raid, the Bighorn Basin was all Bighorn County, and the county seat was Basin. Felix Alston was the sheriff. The sheriff had deputies scattered at strategic points over the county. I was his deputy at Hyattville." Spoiler alert, that might not be true. "Abe Kent, a very good friend of mine, was the deputy at Worland." That is true. "And he arrested Herb Brink," keep that name in mind, "for his participation in the Spring Creek raid. This rifle was the one used by Brink in that raid. After Abe had arrested Brink and had taken him to Basin, this rifle and some other things were left in Worland in the care of Abe Kent. After Brink's trial and conviction, Abe gave the rifle to me, and it has been in my possession ever since, and I am presenting it to the association, Stock Growers Association, for their museum. Very truly yours, Clarence H. Gardner." Okay, we have a lot to unpack here. First of all, what was the Spring Creek raid? Okay, in the spring of 1909, 3 sheepmen and 2 of their herders drove a herd of 7,000 sheep into the Bighorn Basin and set up a camp on Spring Creek, which is about 7 or 8 miles south of the little town of Tinsleep in what was then Bighorn County. On the night of April 2nd, 7 cowboys and cattlemen attacked that encampment. They killed 2 of the sheepmen in the wagon, set the wagons on fire. One of the 3 sheepmen came out of the wagon that had been fired and was shot at point-blank range by Herb Brink. They burned all the wagons, killed a bunch of sheep, shot the sheepdogs, and left. And this was only the latest in a series of this type of incidents in the conflict between sheepmen and cattlemen towards the end of the 19th century and the early days of the 20th. Up to 1909, 6 or 7 sheepmen, had been killed by cattlemen in Wyoming, and nobody was ever charged with it. The only person who was charged in one of these conflicts was a sheepman who shot a cattle rancher. He was found guilty and sent to prison, but none of the people who shot the sheepmen and killed their sheep before this Spring Creek raid were ever held accountable for that. It wasn't just in Wyoming. It was throughout the Rocky Mountain West. And there were dozens of incidents, and over 27 sheepmen were killed. New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana. And in fact, when Willie Nickel was killed in 1901 by Tom Horn, it had to do with a cattleman versus sheepman conflict because Willie's father was a sheepman and Tom Horn was employed by the cattleman. So, okay, that is in a nutshell, the Sheep Creek raid. And I want to recommend highly this book. A Vast Amount of Trouble was written by John W. Davis of Worland, Wyoming. Mr. Davis was an attorney in Worland. He retired, I think, in 2016. He's a noted and accomplished historian. He has written this book. He wrote an excellent book about the trial of Tom Horn. He wrote an excellent book about the Johnson County Cattle War in 1892. So, what do we have here? This rifle was lent to the Washakie Museum for their display in an exhibit commemorating the Spring Creek raid. And when it came back to the museum here, there was explanatory material attached to it that said, this wasn't Herb Brink's rifle because Herb Brink used a 25-35. Okay, wait. We need to chase that one down. So again, I was able to access and note in Mr. Davis's book that he said that Brink had used a 25-35, not a 32. So I went downstairs to State Archives, and with the help of the folks down there, Susie and Robin are great folks and history geeks and helped me out a lot. I was able to access the trial transcript of the Brinks trial. And 700 pages, thank God I didn't have to read the whole thing, but in the very early testimony, Sheriff Felix Alston testified about what he found and observed at the crime scene under questioning from Will Metz, who was the lead prosecuting attorney. And Alston reported picking up 25-35 cartridges, 30-30 cartridges, 35 automatic cartridges, and 45 Colt cartridges. Empties. Now, the first three are rifle cartridges. The 45 Colt is a handgun cartridge, of course. So, okay, that casts some serious doubt on whether or not this particular rifle was used by Herb Brink. But I got this letter, in working with other firearms and other stories, this is pretty solid provenance. This is a guy who was on the ground in 1909 and was involved in this event. And here's his letter saying that this rifle was seized from Herb Brink. Well, again, back to John Davis's book. The guy who used the 35 semi-automatic threw it in a creek. Then decided that wasn't good enough, so he fished it out of the creek, wrapped it in a gunny sack, and hid it in a chicken house. So was Herb Brink smart enough to think ahead and say, whoa, they're going to pick up those 25-35 cartridges that I left at the crime scene where we killed those guys? And did he dispose of or do something with that 25-35, acquire this 32, knowing that there would not be any 32 cartridges found there? That's just my speculation, but it would make a certain amount of sense. So as this thing sort of unraveled, I wanted to confirm, okay, was this Abe Kent actually a special deputy at that time, and did he arrest Herb Brink? Well, yeah, he did. We were able, again, thanks to the folks downstairs in archives, we were able to find a newspaper article from that era where they reported that Special Deputy Abe Kent had showed up in Basin with Herb Brink under arrest. So, okay, that pans out. And so I couldn't find anything about this C.H. Gardner, this Clarence Gardner, who claimed to also have been a deputy. And I was reaching the point where I've done as much as I want to do with this. I'm just going to take that at face value. Well, once again, I was just happened to be thumbing through John Davis's great book, and I came across this report of jury selection for the Herb Brink trial. And he says, it's not clear how it came about, but another juror was then drawn, C.H. Gardner. That's our guy, right? That's the guy who wrote the letter and claimed to have had this rifle in his possession for 45 years, 50 years, and donated it, claiming it was used by Brink. Okay, so this goes on. All these men were passed for cause, although the prosecution must have tried hard to show the prejudice of Gardner. Clarence Gardner was a cattleman, ranching on Paint Rock Creek near Hyattville. He had been outspoken against sheepmen and sheep in the basin. And one witness even told the grand jury that he thought Gardner might have been involved in the raid. So the whole thing falls apart. If Gardner had been a deputy, I have to believe that would have showed up in the research that Davis did. It's very common that defense attorneys in particular do not want law enforcement people on a jury, thinking that they will be sympathetic to the prosecution. So again, it's one of those deals where, I've said this before, all of these firearms have a story. Sometimes we know the story, sometimes we don't, and sometimes the story just isn't true. And I don't know exactly what category to put this one in, except there are some serious loose ends. I'm inclined to believe that this carbine was not used in the Spring Creek raid. And again, if you want more information or to know more about it, there's an article that Davis wrote on the Wyoming History website. That's sort of the condensed Reader's Digest version of the Spring Creek raid and the subsequent events. Or if you want the full story, I highly recommend his full book, A Vast Amount of Trouble. So that's the story on this little Winchester carbine, and frankly, I don't know a whole lot more about it now than I did before this whole episode started. So anyway, if you have comments or questions, you can put them in the comments below, or you can give us a call at the museum. And just in passing, I want to give a shout out to one of my loyal viewers, Louis from New Brunswick. He called me at the museum and wanted to talk about Winchester carbines. And he had a carbine, or parts of a carbine. If you saw our video on the Winchester carbines that were used at the Wyoming State Penitentiary, the question was raised about the striations, about the marks on the receiver. And we eventually discovered, not in time to put it into the video, but that those striations were a result of the forging process. So it really came from the factory that way, and those would have initially been covered by the finish, by the bluing on the firearm. So as I talked to Lewis, he said, "Well, I don't have the wood, I don't have the fore-end, I don't have the buttstock, I don't have the magazine tube." So he's got a project ahead of him. But again, we're always glad to talk to people. And before I leave this, I want to make another point that was disturbing to me about this particular rifle. I noticed that the receiver, the barrel, and the stock had been scrubbed. And that destroys the originality of the firearm. It vastly decreases the collector value. So when I got into the accession file, there was a notation in there that a museum employee in 1970 had scraped the patina off the receiver with a razor blade and number 9 steel wool. I want to go back in time and slap him. I understand that 50 years ago there were not university programs that taught you how to be a museum curator and taught you how to treat artifacts. But even 50 years ago, gun collectors knew and stressed that originality is key. Even if it's been used and abused and is rusty and beat up, don't mess with it, because that's the original condition. That's what tells a story, and that's what makes it valuable. And unfortunately, the guy back in 1970 didn't have that message. So anyway, thanks for watching.